So next I'd like to talk about speech as a major feature of human cognition. Production and understanding of speech is a characteristic human capability which isn't present in any other animal to anything like the same degree. We use sound to communicate our thoughts in a way that creates similar thoughts in the mind of a hearer. And reading makes this possible when the brains of speaker and hearer are widely separated in time and space. The maximum rate at which we produce speech is about 3 words per second, but writing can be understood at a somewhat higher rate, perhaps 4 to 5 words per second. So let's think about these 3 major aspects of speech: comprehension, production, and reading in turn. We can extract meaning from sounds made by a speaker even when there's a lot of other sounds in the environment. We can break up the stream of sound into words, correct for mispronunciations, and process grammatical and other structural information to distinguish between different possible meanings of words or the groups of words. We can generate speech from a vocabulary of more than 30,000 words, and the words we produce are organized into a grammatical structure that's needed to create the appropriate meaning, and we only get about 1 word in 1,000 wrong. It takes about 5 years for a human being to learn effective use of speech. Reading is a rather less noisy channel than hearing. We can exclude irrelevant visual inputs more easily than irrelevant sounds, and the separation of the stream of information into distinct words is much clearer. But the structural information provided by pauses and intonation during speech must be replaced by punctuation. We can focus on one meaningful channel within a lot of background noise. There's a lot of redundancy in speech, and that means we can correct for errors like mispronunciations. In an experiment, subjects were asked to listen to a stream of speech and repeat it as they heard it. If some mispronunciation occurred later in a word, as in the example tomorrain rather than tomorrow, it was observed that the subjects were generating the correct version before their brains had had time to process the mispronounced sound. And furthermore, most subjects didn't notice the mispronunciation. So the implication is that what we hear is at least partly determined by the images we're developing. A word can have multiple meanings. The word roll can refer to a roll of carpet, a bread roll, rolling a ball, rolling a lawn, having a role like the conductor of an orchestra. The brain usually has no problem in using nearby speech to identify the appropriate meaning in the context. Some other experiments demonstrated that for about 20% of the words you hear in a conversation, you only get the meaning of the word after your brain has processed a couple of later words. Somehow the meaning is filled in only when you've got a bit more information. And of course, the order in which words are heard determines the relationship between those words, the meaning of the phrase or sentence. The interpretation of a segment of speech, a group of words, results from accumulation of information over a much larger temporal window than the speech segment itself. The meaning of a phrase may be determined by the content of several sentences before or even after the phrase. So let's have a look at how words are linked into a higher level meaning in a bit more detail. And these are some of the major ways in which the appropriate links are communicated. Word order is a critical factor in developing the meaning of a group of words. To use a major example, in English at least, the word indicating the subject of a phrase usually precedes the word indicating the action of that subject, the verb. which is then followed by the object on which the action is taken. So to communicate that someone called David is in pursuit of someone called Mark, in English we say David chases Mark. The order is subject, verb, object. But that's not the only option. Obviously, there are half a dozen possibilities, and the usual order is not the same in all languages. And the use of an order inappropriate to the language will be confusing or communicate the wrong thing. David Mark chases David Mark are not very meaningful in English, although the use of pauses, stress, or intonation can sometimes provide a meaning to a different word order. Most languages predominantly use the order subject, object, verb. Japanese is one example. Other languages, like English, predominantly uses David chases Mark. And in fact, these types of languages that usually use the subject, verb, object order have the most speakers. So these two types of orders are very much the majority, and the predominant use of some of the other word orders is almost non-existent. Hickscariana and Wario are languages spoken by small groups in South America, and their predominant use of these word orders is actually not certain. Our brains have to get information from the individual words and combine it appropriately to generate meaning. And the combination process will involve some kind of information processes implemented by neurons. So perhaps the predominance of certain word orders indicates that these word orders are easier to handle with the physiological information processes that are available. Another way in which information about the relationships between words can be communicated is by varying the sounds. If I go back to the ordering of subject, verb, and object again, the word order communicated that David was the subject doing the chasing and Mark was the object being chased. But in the case of the third-person pronouns, he is the pronoun for the subject and him the pronoun for the object. And using these pronouns can therefore maintain meanings even if a different word order is used. So, for example, chases he him tends to imply a question asking if he is chasing him. And it's a bit easier to understand than chases David Mark, although in both cases the structure feels a little odd, and understanding really needs some word emphasis. A third critical factor is the use of pauses. For example, in establishing which words are most strongly associated. So if you look at the sentence, she collects all sorts of things, silver, paper, hats, clocks, with longer pauses in the places indicated by the dots. The meaning is different from if the same words are spoken, she collects all sorts of things, silver, paper, hats, clocks, or she collects all sorts of things, silver, paper, hats, clocks, because the locations of the pauses determines whether paper is separate or associated with silver or associated with hats. Stress and intonation are also important for controlling meaning. Meanings of words, for example. English perhaps uses this mechanism for word meaning less than in some other languages. But even in English, emphasis can make a big difference to the meaning of sentences. If you consider the sentence, I never said he was dating her, the meaning shifts depending on which word is stressed. I never said he was dating her. 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 Each sentence has a different meaning depending on which word is stressed. So in speech, nouns, verbs, and adjectives carry what you might call the primary elements of information. But to extract the overall meaning, the brain must perform a number of processes on these elements. So all these additional pieces of information can be regarded as signals indicating the way in which the primary information should be processed. The signals differ between languages, but it's likely that the information processes are similar between brains, and different signals can trigger similar processes, although perhaps in a different order. So you could think about understanding speech in terms of different features. Extraction of information about the sounds that are present, called phonological information, extraction of grammatical information, and extraction of information about the meanings of words, what we call semantic information, and then extraction of the concepts being communicated by speech. A simple physical model might be that there's physical components in the brain corresponding with all these features. The component that extracts sound primitives, called phonemes, from the auditory inputs provides outputs to components extracting grammatical information and word meaning information, and then the concept extraction component gets inputs from these two earlier components and determines the overall meaning. However, it's clear from the speech phenomena that we've been describing that the reality is a lot more complex than this rather simplistic physical model. For example, extracted semantic information influences the sounds that are perceived. The higher level concept that's been extracted influences the word meanings that are determined. And the higher level concept can even influence the sounds detected, and other dependencies also exist. So there's a complex interaction between all these functions. They're not performed in anything like a serial fashion. So in reality, you could perhaps describe the features of speech processing using these phonological information, grammatical information, semantic information, concept information components, but the physical processing of information by the brain doesn't fall into these categories. In other words, much like for a computer, as we discussed earlier, the way we tend to divide up the features of speech processing to categorize what's going on don't correspond with the way the brain is actually doing it.